It all started like any other big sale, the kind of frenzy that gets people lining up before dawn, clutching their wallets with dreams of snagging a bargain. I had saved up for this, a massive 90% off everything event that only comes around once a year. When I finally stepped into the store, it was chaos. People tearing through racks, grabbing anything that might fit, laughing, shouting, even shoving. The place was alive with energy, almost overwhelming. I thought it was all just part of the fun. I didn't realize how quickly that energy would turn into something far darker. Almost immediately, I felt something strange. I didn't catch anything relevant at first, just noticed the staff especially. They were moving quickly but looked skittish, barely even glancing at the shoppers. I'd catch a worker darting a look over their shoulder or whispering to another employee with a look that wasn't the typical just another day at the job vibe. Then I heard it. Somewhere nearby there was this heavy thud, a very loud, hollow sound, like something dense falling, followed by a muffled yell. I assumed someone had knocked over a display or fallen, but when I looked around, no one seemed to react. Not the shoppers, who were too preoccupied, and especially not the employees, who seemed to just freeze for a second and then get back to their routine, pretending nothing happened. Another thud, another shout. This time it was a sharp, panicked scream, but the noise of the crowd seemed to drown it out. Only a few people around me seemed to pause, looking around, confused. But how could anyone ignore the gravity of it? Something terrible had clearly happened. Judging by the screams, it sounded like someone had been hurt. Then suddenly, I noticed the lights dimming, just slightly. The escalator nearest to me jolted to a stop, and a few people on it stumbled as it gave out, suddenly silent. That's when I noticed the manager standing near the main entrance, hands clenched, eyes darting around the store as if searching for something, or someone. His face was pale, his gaze sharp, and for a second, I thought he looked straight at me. But he looked away just as fast, back to the door, his posture tense, like he was waiting for something bad to happen. The sudden shift in the store's atmosphere was jarring, and it didn't take long for the sense of unease to spread. The hum of the lights had changed, like a deep, unsettling vibration just beneath the surface of everything. People started to stop what they were doing, looking around with uncertainty, some instinctively glancing toward the exits. A few shoppers began to exchange nervous, confused looks. And I saw the employees, usually so quick to help or direct, start moving faster. I wasn't the only one who noticed. A young man next to me in the electronics section gave a nervous chuckle, trying to make light of it. "Think they're just trying to rush us out so they can go home early?" he said, but his voice cracked just a bit, as if even he didn't believe it. A woman, holding an armful of clothing, looked toward the escalators and frowned. She began walking toward them. But before she could reach the base, another employee, her eyes wide and her face pale, rushed toward her and grabbed her arm. "Ma'am, we need to clear the store. Right now. Please," she said, her voice shaky, as if she was barely holding it together. The woman shook off her grip, clearly annoyed, but a deeper unease was creeping into the way she carried herself. She took a few steps back, giving the employee a confused, hesitant look before walking toward the front, muttering something under her breath. I stood there, frozen in place. People were starting to crowd and push, like at a concert. It was becoming extremely difficult to exit or enter the store. But the employees continued their strange movements, darting in and out of the back rooms, just confused as the crowd. No one seemed to know how to manage the mess it was becoming. Half of the people were trying to pay quickly and go home, while the other half wanted to leave the store, their hands slipping away from the merchandise as if unsure whether it was even worth the effort. And then the announcement came. The store's PA system crackled to life. The voice, clipped and muffled, barely audible over the growing clamor in the store, made a half-hearted attempt to be reassuring. "Attention, shoppers," the voice said, but the static made it hard to understand. "Due to unforeseen circumstances, we are closing the store immediately. Please head to the exits. We apologize for the inconvenience." The voice faltered, as if it had been cut off. There was a brief silence before another burst of static interrupted the PA, and a loud, almost mechanical voice followed. "This is not a drill. You must evacuate immediately." The words sent a jolt of panic through customers. It was so crowded that we couldn't see the exit doors anymore. There were groups moving to one side, other ones pushing to the other side of the store. And there were a few customers lingering, as though they hadn't yet fully processed what was happening, which made everything more difficult. A shrill, high-pitched alarm blared from every corner of the store, making it impossible to think or hear anything else. My ears rang with the intensity of it, and people instinctively began to cover their ears or shield their faces. I glanced around again, my chest tightening. Employees were still ushering people toward the exits, but there were fewer of them now. The urgency was unspeakable, and we almost couldn't breathe. And then, without warning, security doors slammed open with a violent thunk, metal grinding against metal, unlocking the fire exits from both sides. Panic shot through the crowd like wildfire. A few people near the doors pushed at the barricades, desperate to escape. After everyone managed to get out, our feet seemed to freeze to the sidewalk, as if trying to make sense of the situation. I turned to look back one last time, and right before the doors banged shut, I saw something I'll never forget. An aisle filled with crumpled, abandoned carts and a dark red stream trickling down the stairs, disappearing into the shadows. Outside, people still scattered into the streets, some sobbing, others silent, all of us shaken. None of us knew what had happened in that store, but we didn't wait to see more.
Thanksgiving at my aunt's place has always been this chaotic, sprawling mess. 30, sometimes 40 people crammed into a house that was never meant for more than 10. The kids running around, adults crammed shoulder to shoulder, talking over one another. It's the same every year, loud, messy, but it's family after all. In fact, I barely know half of the people that attend every Thanksgiving. Sometimes I feel like an outsider, sitting around. But my mom had that look when I told her I'd sneak out, so here I was, pressed between my uncle and a cousin I hadn't seen in years, trying to pick at the salad that was supposed to be my contribution. I was in that headspace, distracted and kind of just getting through it, when a man I didn't recognize sat down beside me. I assumed he was maybe my cousin's husband, or maybe a new friend of one of them. He just blended in, giving me this polite smile before introducing himself in this low, quiet voice that I almost missed in the crowd. I didn't catch his name. It was one of those quick intros, just a murmur and a handshake, and then he went back to piling food on his plate. I was relieved at first, thinking maybe he was as uncomfortable with the crowd as I was. As the dinner went on, I couldn't help but notice little things about him, though. He was watching people more than he was talking, and when he did say something, it was in this oddly detached way. Not standoffish exactly, just distant, like he was studying everyone from a step removed. I figured he might just be quiet or nervous. There's always someone at Thanksgiving who feels like they're just there to survive the day. But after a while, he started talking to me, his questions casual at first. Things like, "So you're from out of town, right?" Or, "How long have you been in school?" Basic stuff. But then he began asking about my family, too. How often I saw them, where I spent my time, and this one caught me off guard, whether I'd kept up with any of my cousins from when I was younger. I didn't think much of it, not right away, because Thanksgiving conversations always get a little weird when you're with people you don't see often. But there was something in the way he asked, almost like he was searching for something. I figured maybe he was just being polite, making small talk since I looked as out of place as he did. Still, his eyes had this unsettling focus, like he wasn't just asking for the sake of conversation. Then he made a comment about my aunt. Something about the year she decided to keep things small and didn't invite everyone. I almost laughed at that because small and Thanksgiving were never two words that went together in our family. But the way he said it sounded like he knew this story better than I did, like he'd been there, though I'd never seen him in my life. As he went on, it became clearer that he knew these stories about everyone, that only someone who'd been around would know, but they were just a bit off. Like he'd been there, but he got details wrong, like the color scheme or the name they'd picked. He'd talk about people's kids, but mix up their ages. I shrugged it off, trying to tell myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he'd just heard these stories through someone else. I told myself it didn't matter. He was just another face in the crowd, lost in the mess of too many people in one place. But even though I felt this growing unease, I couldn't stop talking with him. There was a curiosity, this creeping sense that something wasn't right. Every time I looked over at him, he'd be watching something else, like he was cataloging details. As the night wore on, the stranger's questions only got more pointed, and every answer I gave seemed to lead him to another, more personal one. It felt strange, but I kept telling myself he was just trying to make conversation. Maybe he didn't know anyone else there. Maybe he was nervous and filling the silence. But it wasn't just chit-chat anymore. He started hinting at things that hadn't crossed my mind in years. At one point, he leaned over, looking straight at me with this calm expression, and asked, "Do you still remember that summer by the lake?" The way he said it made my stomach twist. I hadn't thought about that summer in ages. It was one of those things my family never talked about, something we'd all silently agreed to forget. I tried to laugh, but he was waiting, eyes on me like he expected a real answer. I stumbled out a vague reply, hoping he'd move on. He didn't. Instead, he shifted the conversation to my uncle, mentioning a rumor that had made its way through the family years ago, something sensitive that I'd almost forgotten. He was casual about it, as if we were just gossiping, but he skillfully kept pressing on answers and details. By then, I was watching him carefully, barely responding, just trying to understand how he knew these things. Had he heard stories from someone else? Was he related to one of my distant cousins? I scanned the room, trying to catch someone's eye, but everyone was either lost in their own conversations or already clearing their plates, setting up for the family photo. I felt this sudden, sharp need to talk to my mom, to pull her aside and ask if she knew him. But she was so busy with my siblings, talking and wiping the tables. As we all gathered for the photo, the stranger stepped back, hanging at the edge of the crowd, watching us with this faint smile, like he was satisfied. I blinked, and in that second, he was gone. I looked around, expecting him to be standing nearby, but he just vanished. It wasn't like he had slipped into another room. It was like he'd been there one moment, and the next, there was nothing. I whispered to my mom, asking if she'd seen him, but she gave me a blank look. "Who? There wasn't anyone new this year," she said, shrugging her shoulders like it was no big deal. I went to my cousins, aunts, uncles, but no one knew who he was or what conversations I was talking about. And every time I tried to explain, they just didn't care. "Maybe you were distracted," they laughed. "There were so many of us here tonight, anyone would feel lost." I left the house that night feeling like I was losing it, like I'd imagined the whole thing. I kept replaying his words, the look in his eyes, the calm way he'd talked about our family's secrets like he'd been there all along. I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, every creak and whisper reminding me of his face, his questions. Then, just as I was about to drift off, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from an unknown number. "Thanks for the meal. I'll see you again next year."
It's not like I expected this season to be anything special. My roommates went to spend the holidays in their hometowns. While in college, you either go home and deal with the effort of traveling, or you just stay on campus because it's too expensive to fly back. I decided to stay. I'm used to being alone every now and then. I didn't think I'd miss it, but I did. The usual noise, the smells of roasting turkey, the buzz of relatives fighting over football or politics. The way my mom would always tell me to stop messing with the gravy when I was a kid. I thought I'd be fine this year. I had other things to worry about, papers to finish, an exam coming up. I had a couple of friends who'd invited me to their family dinners, but I don't know. It felt weird, and honestly, I wasn't in the mood for the pity looks. I wasn't that homesick. So I decided to make dinner for myself, just enough to make me feel like I was participating. I went to the grocery store, picked up a frozen turkey breast, a couple cans of cranberry sauce, and a box of stuffing mix. That was all I could really afford anyway, but it felt like it would be enough. I wasn't going to pretend like it was anything fancy. I'd be fine with just the basics. I set everything up in my dorm room, the TV muted in the background while I worked in the kitchen area. It was just me, but that's okay. The loneliness, it's just quietness. The turkey turned out better than I expected, and I managed to make the stuffing without burning it. It wasn't perfect, but it tasted like something familiar, like the way it's supposed to taste. I ate slowly, savoring every bite, trying not to think about the emptiness of the space around me. The TV was still on, but I wasn't really watching it. I was just sort of zoning out, shoving food in my mouth like I was trying to fill a void I couldn't explain. Afterward, I did the dishes, cleaned up the kitchen. That's the part that always feels like a real meal, I guess, when you clean up and you're left with that little sense of accomplishment. I felt okay, kind of full, a little warm from the food. But then, when I opened the fridge the next morning to put away the leftovers, I noticed something odd. Half the turkey was gone. At first, I thought maybe I had eaten more than I remembered. It wasn't out of the question. I'm a bit of a stress eater, and I'd been feeling the pressure of schoolwork lately, so I ignored it, even though I thought I'd clearly left more on the plate. It wasn't much, maybe a few slices, no big deal. But then, the next day, more of the stuffing was gone. Not much, just enough to be noticeable, a couple of spoonfuls. This time, there was no excuses. I knew I hadn't eaten it. I'd eaten my meal, but I hadn't gone back for seconds. I hadn't even thought about it. Was I eating in my sleep or something? I know, it sounds stupid, but it seemed like the only plausible explanation at the time. And it kept happening. Day after day, more food was missing. Sometimes it would be from the fridge, sometimes from the counter. Once I noticed the cranberry sauce had been disturbed. I started to feel completely paranoid that I was imagining things, and I didn't want to be that person, the one who freaks out over nothing. But deep down, I felt fear. It didn't make any sense. I told myself it could be a neighbor stealing me. Maybe they were coming in and taking some food thinking I wasn't around. That's what I wanted to believe. Because it wasn't my fault, and I surely wasn't alone. I set up my phone to record the nights. Just a couple of hours, that's all. If something was going on, I'd have proof. But I wasn't prepared for what I saw when I went through the footage the next morning. There was someone inside the dorm, a figure, moving around in the kitchen while I was asleep. Quietly, almost. Too quietly. I watched in disbelief as the person went straight to the fridge, pulled out the turkey, and started eating it. He wasn't in a hurry. He just ate, like he was at home. No rush, no care. I thought maybe it was a prank at first, but the longer I watched, the more my stomach dropped. I recognized him. It was an old roommate. He'd disappeared months ago after we had a falling out. He'd left without a word, packed up in the middle of the night, and just vanished. I didn't think much of it at the time. We didn't get along. He didn't owe me an explanation. Still, I never heard from him again, and after a while, I figured he'd just moved on. But now I knew he'd been coming back, sneaking in when I was gone. And the worst part, he seemed to know when I wasn't home. That is so screwed up. He'd wait until I was at class, or sleeping, or until I was in the middle of a study session, and then he'd let himself in. I don't know how he got in. Maybe he still had the key. Maybe he'd been coming in for weeks, taking bits and pieces of my food like he belonged there. It made me furious, nauseated. The footage couldn't lie. He was there eating my Thanksgiving leftovers like nothing had changed. I didn't know what to do at the time. Should I call the cops? Confront him? The idea of confronting him felt like a bad joke. He was a stranger to me now, but how did he get in, and why? I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen. The footage ended with him putting the turkey back in the fridge like it was just another part of his routine. That's when I realized he hadn't been gone. He never left, or at least the footage didn't capture it, which made me even more confused. I didn't know how long it would keep happening, but I was thinking about him every time I opened the fridge, every time I went to bed. I didn't know if I was more afraid of the food going missing or of what he could be doing while I slept. To make things worse, the recordings disappeared from my phone this week, right before I decided to tell someone. I'm so exhausted that I ended up spending the last few days at a cheap hostel nearby. Now I don't know what to do again. It feels like I'm crazy, but I know he is quietly slipping in whenever I let my guard down. I just want my roommates to come back home so I can feel like things are normal again, or at least pretend they are.
It started as just another Black Friday, the kind of day you brace for and hope goes by quickly. My friend and I thought we'd get an early jump on the mall, make it fun and take our little siblings along. It seemed like a good idea at the time, bonding over some shopping and letting the kids have their fill of excitement. The mall was packed, of course, but we were prepared for that. The noise was overwhelming, with a constant drone of announcements, laughter, and the sound of 100 different conversations crashing together. When we first walked in, the kids were practically bouncing with excitement, their hands wrapped tightly in ours as they pointed out every decoration and display. At first, I found it sort of charming. Everything was over the top. Neon sale signs on every storefront, glittery Christmas lights trying to outshine one another, and holiday music blaring from every corner. It was loud, but familiar, and the crowd felt like part of the whole festive experience. We just moved with the flow, our voices swallowed up in the noise, but it didn't bother me. We were squeezed shoulder to shoulder with people, shuffling along from store to store, nudging and weaving our way through. I remember catching glances at the kids, watching them look at every little thing in awe. They were pointing at things they wanted and dragging us from one display to the next. The energy of it all was contagious, and we found ourselves laughing along, getting caught up in the magic of the day. But somewhere in the mix, the feeling went from exciting to manic. People pushed without looking, heads down, eyes and arms locked on shelves as if their lives depended on it. I tried to keep my little sister close, holding her hand tighter as the hallways grew narrower and the spaces more packed. We tried to step aside a few times, letting the kids look at displays and games in quieter corners, but every time we stopped, the flow of people just surged around us, pressing in until we had to start moving again. The crowd was becoming this solid thing that moved us wherever it wanted. It was like standing still was against the rules. I started feeling irritated and trapped, tugging my sister's hand to keep her close, wondering how people could be this oblivious, so absorbed in their deals that they didn't notice us at all. We finally stopped at a toy store, and the kids got crazy about a massive Lego display. I kept a grip on her hand, letting her look at the different sets and laughing at her excitement. But in a single split second, as I grabbed a quick gift for later and let go of her hand, she was gone. I spun around, thinking maybe she'd gotten distracted by another display or drifted toward the door. I called her name, my voice sounding almost silly amid all the noise, swallowed up immediately by the confusion around me. My friend noticed my panic and started looking too, calling out her name in his loudest voice, but it barely registered in the noise. People bumped into us, barely looking up, just hurrying past, and it hit me how isolated we were in this crowd. The panic set in fast, thinking about a million what-ifs while I tried to push down the worst thoughts. I knew I had only looked away for a second, but a second felt like forever here, with people closing in from every direction. It was like she'd disappeared into thin air, swallowed up by the same sea of strangers I'd laughed off just moments ago. We pushed through the aisles, peering around and checking every display, and still, nothing. It's amazing how fast panic can take over. I can't say how long we searched. I wanted so badly to believe she'd just wandered off to find something she thought was cool, maybe got distracted. But with every frantic scan of another crowded store, that hope started to thin. I contacted the mall security, who started searching and making announcements about her disappearance. Still, I was desolated, and my friend tried to help me keep it together, telling me she couldn't have gone far, that we'd find her any minute. But there was this hollow feeling in my chest that wouldn't go away. My mind started cycling through worst-case scenarios, images that horrified me, possibilities I didn't want to consider. We tried asking people around us, hoping someone might have seen her. But everyone we saw hardly looked at us, too busy, too caught up in their own shopping. A woman, barely glancing up from her phone, just mumbled, "Kids get lost here all the time. She'll turn up." I can't explain the anger I felt at that moment, like the whole world was moving around me, ignoring this horrible, gut-wrenching fear building in my chest. People were oblivious to the fact that something terrible was happening right next to them. I wanted to scream to make them understand, but it wouldn't have mattered. They were all strangers in their own bubbles, too wrapped up in their lives to notice someone else's nightmare. Eventually, we made our way to the quieter parts of the mall, hoping she'd ended up somewhere less crowded. It felt so strange being there, away from the rush and noise. The lights were dimmer, and every sound seemed amplified, like our footsteps echoing down those narrow, empty hallways. Part of me was relieved to be out of the crush of people, but another part felt an even darker kind of fear. If she was lost out here, alone in these empty corridors, I didn't want to finish that thought. Then I saw it, just lying there, half hidden under a bench by the loading dock entrance, her stuffed toy, the small, faded bunny she carried everywhere. I started to cry, crumbling inside. She'd had it with her all day, clutching it tightly even as we walked through the crowds. I remember teasing her, telling her she didn't need to hold onto it in the mall, that she was too old for it. She'd looked at me with these wide, innocent eyes and clung to it even tighter. Now, seeing it lying there, in a spot so out of the way, my world was shattered. She was everything to me, the person I loved the most in my life. How could I let this happen? I walked over, picked it up, hoping for some kind of explanation to pop into my mind, anything to make this feel less wrong. But there was nothing. Just that silent, terrible realization that she hadn't dropped it by accident. She'd left it there, like a trail or a cry for help. I looked around hoping to see her standing somewhere close, hiding. Maybe grinning in that shy, mischievous way kids do when they think they've tricked you. But the hallway was empty, just the quiet hum of the ventilation, the faint echo of faraway shoppers in the distance. It was like the rest of the mall. The bright, noisy crowd was in a different world from where I was standing. Back in the crowd alone, I decided to bring the toy to the mall security, hoping it would help them find her quickly. I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head. Every second of it, every choice I made, seemed to mock me now. I could still feel her hand in mine, that fleeting moment of trust when I'd let go, just for a second. What might have happened? The toy in my hand felt like a reminder of everything I'd failed to do, everything I'd let slip through my fingers. Then, just as the panic seemed ready to suffocate me completely, The mall security team arrived. One of the guards was holding her, my sister. Her eyes wide, face pale, but she was alive. My breath caught in my throat, and I almost collapsed in tears of relief. But seconds after hugging her tight, I felt nothing but the most hollow ache of guilt. She had been scared, alone, lost. The realization was sinister. How easily the person we love the most could vanish in a world that is so shallow, so indifferent.
I never thought Thanksgiving could feel like this. Quiet, tense. We hadn't been a full family since my mother passed away, but this year felt different. I'd reached out to Dad for the first time in years, hoping to bring him back, if only for one night. It took everything in me to go to his house just to invite him. After Mom died, he'd all but vanished. I only heard bits and pieces through old family friends, but I knew he lived alone and hadn't moved far. When he finally answered the door, looking older than I imagined, there was hesitation when I asked him to come to Thanksgiving, like he was sizing up some hidden cost, weighing if he could handle it. After a long pause, he nodded and said he'd try. I didn't dare press him further, though a part of me wanted to beg him to say he'd be there. But Thanksgiving Day came and went without a sign of him. As the day stretched on, my family's polite glances turned into side eyes. They could see my hope draining. Every time I tried calling, his phone went straight to voicemail. The clock ticked, the food got cold, and by dusk, I couldn't ignore the unease settling in my chest. I had to see if he was okay. Maybe something had happened to him, or maybe he just needed someone to show up and remind him he wasn't alone. The drive to his house was intense, every possible outcome running through my mind. But when I got there, I knew something was wrong. His door was unlocked. My dad was meticulous about security. Even before he distanced himself, he was the type to check the locks twice. I stood in the doorway, torn between the impulse to call out and the nagging worry of what I might find. Inside, the house was almost unnervingly clean, but with an empty, echoing feel. I wandered into the dining room, and that's when I saw the table, set for one, with his favorite dish untouched and perfectly plated. I stood there, staring at that single place setting. I scrambled through memories, the familiar pang of regret pressing down on me. All I was left with was the faint scent of casserole, a silent room, and the empty echo of everything we'd never said.
Black Friday was always intense, but this year felt next level. I'd been eyeing this new gadget for months, a limited edition tablet with all the bells and whistles, and now it was finally on sale. I'd gotten up before dawn, shoved down a quick breakfast, and joined the crowd outside the store before they even unlocked the doors. Inside, it was pandemonium. People were grabbing whatever they could, practically piling on themselves. The line was a good 40 minutes deep, stretching back through 2 corridors, with people jostling and elbowing one another. But I was so close to getting the tablet that the line seemed worth it. After about 10 minutes, I noticed a store employee weaving through the line, looking at people's carts, whispering something, and then moving on. When he got to me, he smiled and gestured to my cart, asking if I was there for the tablet deal. I nodded, and he leaned in a bit, lowering his voice. "We're actually piloting a VIP checkout today for early shoppers. Only a few people know about it. It'll cut your wait time in half." VIP checkout sounded perfect to me, so I was immediately interested. He explained the process. They'd scan my face and get my phone number and address, then direct me to a special counter where my purchase would already be processed, ready to go. Honestly, it sounded a little weird, but nowadays every company has our personal data anyway. And he had the uniform, the name tag, and the badge, so I didn't even question if it was a legitimate store's holiday deal. I handed over my phone, letting him scan my info and let him do a quick facial scan on his device. He thanked me, and told me to follow him through a side aisle to a small checkout desk where a cashier was ready. They didn't ask any questions, just handed me a bag with the tablet, and I walked out of the store feeling like I'd hit the jackpot. After leaving the store, I felt pretty smug. I'd snagged the tablet, skipped the wait, and barely broke a sweat. I even texted a friend to brag a little, sending a photo of my prize from the car. It was shaping up to be a great day, until my phone buzzed with a weird notification about an account authorization. I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just another sales alert or holiday spam. But over the next hour, notifications kept coming in, random texts from unfamiliar numbers, emails about transactions I didn't recognize. Then my phone froze, the screen going completely white. I tried to restart it, but nothing happened. Now I was annoyed. First, because my brand new gadget was losing some of its glow. And second, because I couldn't even check my messages or account to figure out what was going on. I borrowed a friend's phone to check my bank app, and that's when I felt a wave of dread hit me. There were withdrawals, large ones, that I definitely hadn't made. Hundreds of dollars had disappeared within the last half hour. My heart started pounding as I scrolled through the list of transactions, none of which I recognized. I decided to go back to the store, figuring it had to be some kind of error with their system. But when I explained the situation to a clerk, he just looked at me blankly. There was no VIP checkout, he said, and the employee who helped me, he couldn't find any record of him. I stood there, replaying the morning in my mind, realizing how quickly I'd handed over my phone, my info, my face, everything. The store staff looked at me with sympathy, but I could tell they thought I'd just been scammed by someone posing as one of them. I wanted to argue, to say there was no way that guy wasn't real, but what proof did I have? By the time I left, my stomach was in knots. I went home, opened my laptop to try and report it, only to find that my email was already locked. Hours later, I still couldn't regain access to anything. My accounts were empty, my information was gone, and the store had no answers. I spent hours at the police station filling out forms and explaining everything to a tired-looking officer who nodded along but didn't seem all that interested. They filed a report, took down the details, and told me they'd look into it. But the look in his eyes told me they wouldn't. When I asked if they'd heard of any other cases like mine, he just shrugged and mumbled something about common holiday scams. I walked out of there feeling numb. A few hours ago, I had my money, my identity, my excitement over a simple purchase. Now, they were just gone, and no one was coming to help. My identity was now in someone else's hands, free to be used in ways I couldn't even imagine.
It was my first Thanksgiving working at the inn, and I had no idea what I was in for. Nestled on the outskirts of a fog-covered New England town, the establishment was the kind of place people imagine when they think of a rustic, charming inn. It was a family-owned business, and though the town was quiet year-round, Thanksgiving was a different story. The inn's Thanksgiving feast was legendary, and I had been hired on as a seasonal chef to help with the dinner preparations. The kitchen was bustling with activity when I arrived that morning, but there was something strange about the way the head chef moved around it. She was an elderly woman, hunched but spry, with dark, intense eyes that seemed to never stop scanning the room. From the start, it was clear she ran the kitchen with an iron grip. Her movements were efficient, sure, but there was an air of mystery about her. She seemed to have a deep personal connection with every recipe, especially the one for the turkey and stuffing, which was, according to her, a family secret passed down through generations. "Don't mess with it," she warned me as she handed me the ingredients list for the stuffing. "The recipe's been perfected over time. Follow it to the letter. No variations." "Got it?" I nodded, feeling an uneasy sense of importance in the way she said it. There was a sternness to her words that made me wonder if she'd been burned by a mistake in the past. Despite my unease, I set to work. The day was as chaotic as any Thanksgiving prep, but there was a tension in the air. As the hours passed, I noticed something strange. The kitchen was colder than it should have been, even though the oven was on full blast and the stove was constantly in use. I tried to ignore it at first, just a draft, maybe, but the chill stayed with me. It was like the warmth from the oven couldn't reach the corners of the room where I felt the coldest. And then the food started to cook itself. I don't mean that in a magical sense. I'm no fool. It wasn't as though the turkey was suddenly flying out of the pan. But I would turn my back for just a moment, only to find the stuffing browning on its own. The turkey browning on the other side without me touching it. At first, I thought maybe I'd misjudged the temperature or the cooking times, but there was something wrong about it, like the food was reacting to something beyond my control. I tried to bring it up with the chef, but she waved me off with a dismissive laugh. "Everything's fine," she said. "The recipe has a way of doing that. Trust it." The whole thing left me feeling unsettled. I wasn't sure if she was playing some kind of mind game, or if I was just getting caught up in the madness of the day. Every time I glanced around the kitchen, her sharp eyes seemed to be on me. She rarely spoke, except to give instructions, but I noticed she spent a lot of time hovering near the turkey, her fingers brushing over it like she was checking for something. As evening approached and the guests began arriving, I tried to put my doubts aside. It was normal for places like this to have a sort of aura to them. The guests were excited, talking about their families, their memories of past Thanksgivings at the inn. Everyone was ready to dig into the meal, but as they sat down to eat, I started noticing odd things. The guests were all acting unnervingly eager, almost desperate to taste the meal. They didn't just sit and wait. No, they were leaning forward, eyes wide, as if the food would somehow solve all their problems. Their gazes kept flicking back to her, who smiled knowingly at each of them, like she was playing some kind of game with them. That's when the unease turned to something else, something darker. As I walked past one of the tables, I noticed that the guests were eating faster than they should have, their forks moving mechanically, as though they were in a trance. One woman, sitting at the end of a table, dropped her fork. When I bent down to pick it up for her, I caught a glimpse of her face. She looked different. Her skin was paler than it should have been, and there was something vacant in her eyes. "Everything okay, ma'am?" I asked, trying to keep the concern out of my voice. But she didn't respond. She just smiled, too wide, too knowing, and nodded. I took a step back, feeling the sudden wave of cold air wash over me again. It was like the room had dropped 10 degrees. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I knew something wasn't right. The kitchen had grown even colder, and as I looked across the dining room, I saw the chef standing at the center of it all, watching the guests with an odd satisfaction. I felt dizzy, my head swimming. The air was thick, like I was walking through a fog that only I could see. It felt like the world was slipping out from under me, as if I wasn't quite grounded in reality anymore. I didn't know what it was. Maybe it was the strange temperature, the weird way the food cooked on its own, the guests' unnatural enthusiasm for the meal. But something in me snapped. I needed to step away. I needed to leave the kitchen, leave the room, and just breathe for a moment. But when I turned to go, I saw the chef standing in the doorway, her eyes glinting like she knew exactly what I was thinking. "Don't worry," she said softly, almost kindly. "It'll be fine. Just trust the recipe." But I couldn't trust it. Not anymore. Something was wrong, and I had to figure out what before it was too late. That's when the first strange behavior from the guests started. The woman at the table who had smiled too wide, she started laughing. It wasn't a happy laugh, though. It was sharp, manic, and unsettling. Others began to join in, their laughter echoing through the inn until the whole room seemed to be vibrating with it. And then, the oddest thing of all happened. The chef looked younger. Her skin, once wrinkled and worn, now seemed smoother, almost glowing. like she'd shed years with each passing moment. I didn't know what to do anymore. It was too late to stop it, too late to leave. I was already caught in the web, and there was no getting out now. But I kept my distance, watching everything unravel before me. What was supposed to be a quiet Thanksgiving dinner had turned into something else, something darker, and I feared the worst was yet to come. By the time dinner was served, the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't just the food that felt different. There was a strange energy in the air, something thick and unsettling, like the calm before a storm. I thought it was just me, maybe I was overthinking it, but as I watched the guests sit down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The dining room was warm and cozy, the fire crackling in the stone fireplace, the table covered in glowing candles. It looked like the perfect scene from a holiday postcard. But when the guests began to eat, it was clear that something was off. Their eagerness was almost too much, too desperate. They didn't just sit and enjoy the meal. They hunched over their plates, eyes wide, forkfuls of turkey and stuffing being shoveled into their mouths with a kind of urgency that made me uncomfortable. The laughter that had filled the room earlier had quieted, replaced by the sound of chewing, swallowing, and the occasional clink of silverware. But it was the way they ate that bothered me. There was something mechanical about it, as though they were moving on autopilot, not really tasting the food. They barely looked up from their plates, but when they did, their eyes had a strange, almost vacant look to them. I tried to focus on my work, but my eyes kept drifting to the guests. I saw a man, seated near the window, shovel a huge mouthful of stuffing into his mouth, his cheeks puffing up unnaturally as he chewed with an almost feverish intensity. When he swallowed, it was audible, a loud, wet gulp that made my stomach turn. He didn't seem to notice me staring at him, but there was something unsettling about the way his lips curled into a thin, tight smile after he swallowed, like he was savoring something far beyond just the food. The woman sitting across from him wasn't any better. She had already finished her meal, but she kept reaching for more, piling food onto her plate, her hands shaking slightly. Every time she ate, she'd glance at the elderly woman, who was standing by the door, watching them all with that strange, knowing look. It was as if she was silently encouraging them to eat more, to consume everything in sight. Her presence seemed to have this pull, like she was the center of everything, and we were all just orbiting around her. I felt sick watching them, and the longer I stayed in the room, the more disoriented I became. My head felt heavy, my thoughts sluggish, as though I was trapped in a fog that wouldn't lift. I had to step away, take a breath. I turned to leave the room, but that's when I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. The woman who had smiled too wide earlier, her face had changed. It wasn't just the pallor that was different. Her features were shifting, subtly, like her skin was stretching, trying to accommodate something underneath. I couldn't look away. Her mouth hung open as she chewed, but I swear I saw something else behind her teeth. A darkness, like something inside her was fighting to break free. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, knocking over a tray of utensils. The clatter startled the guests, but none of them seemed to react. They just kept eating, eyes glazed over. I turned to the back of the room where the elderly woman stood, her eyes locked on me now. She smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was a smile full of something darker, something almost predatory. Her skin, which had been so old and wrinkled earlier, was smoother now, her cheeks fuller, her eyes brighter, almost youthful. She looked years younger, and the change had happened so subtly, so quickly, that it was almost impossible to believe it. I wanted to scream, to run out of the room and never look back, but my feet felt glued to the floor. It was like I was waiting for something, some kind of signal, some final act that would make sense of all this madness. But it never came. Instead, the guests continued their feast, and the room began to feel heavier. The food seemed to be disappearing faster now, plates being wiped clean in seconds. I felt dizzy, my stomach churned, and I had to fight the urge to vomit. That's when I saw it again. Another guest, a man who had been sitting near the fire, began laughing. But it wasn't a happy laugh. It was sharp, jagged, like it had been ripped from somewhere deep inside him. The sound sliced through the air, but no one seemed to care. No one even looked up. They just kept eating, some of them laughing too now, though it wasn't joyful. It was manic, desperate. I wanted to leave, to run, but I couldn't bring myself to move. It was as if something was holding me there, anchoring me in place, forcing me to watch. Watch them. Watch her. The recipe, the ingredients, the elderly woman, the entire night. It was all part of something ancient that none of us understood. The guests continued to feast, oblivious to what was happening around them, while the elderly woman watched, her eyes glinting with a satisfaction I couldn't understand. And then, I saw something that made me freeze. A guest near the window looked up at her, his eyes wide with that same empty look, and whispered, "It's happening." I didn't understand what it all meant, but I knew the situation was unbearable. When the first chance came, I ran. I didn't care about the payment, the job, or anything else. All I wanted was to stay alive, to escape before I was consumed by that madness.
At the game store, it was a chaotic blur of flashing lights, clanging registers, and a non-stop noise of desperate voices shouting over each other for discounts. The crowd was always unpredictable, mainly teenagers and young adults who were either too excited or too drunk on the idea of scoring a big-ticket item at a discount. I never got used to it, no matter how many Black Fridays I spent behind that counter. Today was no different. I stood at the register, fingers frozen on the keys, trying to ring up items as quickly as I could. The atmosphere was electric, everyone scrambling, every face gleaming with greed and anticipation, their eyes fixed on the last few PlayStation 5 consoles we had in stock. There were two boys in particular I couldn't stop watching, both around 17, maybe 18, each determined to get their hands on one of the remaining PS5s. The first boy, tall and lanky, had messy brown hair that looked like he hadn't combed it in weeks. His eyes were wide, too wide, like he hadn't slept in days, like his entire life was on the line for this one console. The other boy, shorter, stockier, had an anxious energy about him. He fidgeted, constantly adjusting his hoodie, his eyes darting from the shelf to the people around him. I didn't know why I noticed them more than anyone else. The store was filled with noise, but it felt like I could hear their breathing, the low murmur of their voices as they muttered insults, trying to psych each other out. I tried to keep my head down, not wanting to get involved. I had seen this kind of thing before, two people fighting for the same thing, usually over some obscure game or a controller, but today was different. Today, the PS5 was the ultimate prize, a holy grail, and whoever grabbed it would feel like they had conquered the world. The two boys were now standing face to face, each clutching one end of the box. The rest of the store seemed to blur as they both locked eyes with the console. I couldn't look away. My stomach churned, and I had a feeling something was about to go wrong. But I couldn't figure out what. I had a moment of hesitation, wondering if I should step in, break up the fight before it even started. But I stayed frozen, watching as the scene began to unfold. Both teens tugged at the box, their grips tightening. The first boy, the tall one, yanked it back harder, pulling the other boy off balance. The smaller one stumbled, his feet sliding against the polished floor. He slammed into a nearby shelf, sending a few game cases crashing to the floor. It was a brief moment, but the store fell quiet for just a second. That's when I heard it. Something sharp in the silence, the sound of bones meeting metal as the smaller boy's head hit the edge of the shelf. The taller boy didn't stop. He didn't even flinch. He just grinned, a twisted, almost predatory smile, and pulled the PS5 box back toward him. The crowd started murmuring, unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. The smaller boy rubbed the side of his head, blood dripping from his nose, but he wasn't backing down. He stood up, eyes wild, charging forward with a fury I didn't expect. He threw a punch, catching the taller teen off guard. but the taller boy dodged, slamming the PS5 box into the smaller boy's chest. The force knocked him back, and he crumpled to the floor with a sickening thud. The crowd flinched, some gasping, others pulling out their phones. But no one moved, no one intervened. The larger boy stood over him, his face flushed with adrenaline, holding the box like it was a trophy. He sneered down at the smaller boy, still lying there motionless. I felt my heart race, and for the first time that day, I felt sick. Something wasn't right. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, too loud, too panicked. The taller boy kicked the smaller one in the ribs, the thud reverberating through the store. I couldn't look away, but I also couldn't bring myself to move. My legs felt numb, my hands trembling as I gripped the counter, unsure of what to do. The smaller boy didn't move. He wasn't getting up. His face was pale, blood still dripping from his nose. The crowd had started to pull back now, whispers filling the air, people too afraid to step in, but too curious to turn away. It wasn't until I saw his chest, motionless, that the full weight of what had just happened hit me. The store was quiet, eerily so, but I could still hear the low hum of the store's overhead lights. For a second, I thought time had frozen. Then the manager rushed over, followed by a security guard, and that's when everything exploded. The larger boy, still clutching the PS5 like it was a lifeline, began to retreat. He looked around like a cornered animal, his breathing heavy and frantic. The security guard stepped toward him, arms raised, trying to stop him. But the boy, shaking with panic, swung the box at the guard. That's when the guard reached for his taser gun, and the whole store seemed to gasp at once. The moment the electric charge hit, the boy jerked back, his whole body seizing as he dropped the PS5 box. He collapsed to the floor, twitching uncontrollably. The store went into chaos. People screamed. The manager was shouting for everyone to leave, but no one could move. It was as if everyone was frozen in place, watching the boy struggle on the floor while the other teen lay unconscious in the corner. I stood there, still behind the counter, too stunned to react. My heart pounded in my ears, the noise of the store overwhelming everything. The security guard was kneeling beside the boy, trying to restrain him, but he wasn't moving. Not anymore. I didn't know what had just happened. I didn't know how things had escalated so quickly, or how they had gone so wrong. But it didn't matter. Everything that followed, everything that happened next, was already out of everyone's hands. The store was silent in a way I hadn't experienced before. Most of the customers had fled when the chaos first erupted, while others lingered near the exits, unsure whether they should stay or leave. Some of them had filmed the whole thing on their phones. I knew that because I could see the glow of screens from where I stood behind the counter. Nobody said anything. It was like we all knew there was nothing left to say. The paramedics arrived first. They moved quickly, their faces grim, but there was nothing they could do. The smaller boy, the one who'd been knocked to the ground, was already covered with a white sheet. I couldn't stop staring at it, knowing what was underneath, the blood still visible through the edges of the cloth. The larger boy, the one who'd thrown the punches and been zapped by the taser, was still twitching on the floor, his body jerking every few seconds as the guards tried to restrain him. I don't know why, but I found myself glancing at the PS5 again. It was still sitting there, abandoned in the middle of the floor. The one thing everyone had been fighting for, and now it was just forgotten, as though it was nothing more than a prop in some twisted play. I didn't move for a long time. I don't even remember how long I stood there, staring at the two bodies and the chaos around them. My legs were shaking, my body refusing to act as though everything had just shifted. There was no sudden break in the tension, no dramatic moment where things were explained. It was just a slow, steady unraveling. The store manager was on the phone talking to the police. I couldn't hear much of what she was saying, but I didn't need to. The police would take care of things, I assumed. They would come in, ask questions, maybe arrest someone, but I knew they wouldn't really understand what happened. No one would. The boy who'd been knocked out was still unconscious, his face pale, his lips slightly parted. I kept wondering if he would wake up, if he would say something, anything to explain how it had gone from two teens fighting over a PS5 to someone being killed. But he didn't move. And the longer I stared at him, the more that unease crept in. Maybe he would never wake up. Maybe the last moments he had were filled with confusion and pain, just like the guy who'd hit him. I had a responsibility to do something, didn't I? I kept asking myself that. I should have stepped in earlier, tried to break up the fight before it turned into something worse. But in that moment, I froze. I let it happen. And now, here I was, standing at the edge of something I couldn't fully comprehend, wondering if I had done enough to stop it. Wondering if anything I could have done would have mattered. People in the store were standing around trying to figure out what had just happened. A few of them were speaking to the police, but their voices were low, detached, as though they, too, had been swept up in the chaos and were now left to piece things together. The store had emptied out, leaving only the few stragglers who had stuck around, probably too scared to leave. Now it was a crime scene, something that I knew would be dissected and analyzed. But whatever answers they uncovered wouldn't bring the reality of it back into focus. It wasn't just about the fight anymore. It was about how quickly everything had gone from normal to horrific, and how I had just been there, powerless to stop it. The police officers started questioning everyone, even the ones who had nothing to do with it. They asked the usual questions: what happened? Did anyone see what led up to it? Did anyone try to stop the fight? I stood by the counter listening, wondering how anyone could explain something so senseless. The truth was, there wasn't much to explain. There wasn't a moment where things went wrong. It wasn't like there was a trigger, a single event that made it all fall apart. It was just a slow, steady buildup. I gave my testimonial, but could barely speak about it. Maybe I had been a part of it in a way too, not physically, but in the way I let the whole thing unfold without intervention. And that thought, the thought that I could have stopped it somehow, settled in the pit of my stomach like a stone. Eventually, they started to clear out the scene. The bodies were taken away, and the store began to look less like a war zone and more like a retail space again. But it would never be the same. Something had shifted, and no amount of cleaning up would erase the feeling of what had happened. The store was back to its usual bustle, but there was a strange hollowness in the air, like everything was happening on autopilot. I glanced at the PS5 again, sitting there untouched, the last piece of the puzzle. Just a superficial symbol of how crazy people can get over impulsiveness. As if the mere prospect of saving a few bucks could justify the absurdity of it all.
It was a quiet afternoon when we first noticed the pop-up store. My friends and I were on our usual weekend stroll through the plaza, the one we've been visiting for years. You know the type of place, mostly empty, with a few mid-range shops lining the streets, offering generic brands and seasonal sales. Nothing ever really caught our attention, but that day was different. A bright, flashy banner hung above the entrance of a small store we'd never seen before, the type that would normally scream touristy trap, but there was something enticing about it. 90% off luxury items, one day only. It read in bold letters. I remember thinking that had to be a mistake or a typo. I mean, 90% off in a small plaza like this? It sounded like something too good to be true, but at that moment, I didn't care. I was already thinking about the new designer jacket I'd been eyeing for months. We were drawn in by the crowd of people already lining up outside the store, eager to get in. There was a palpable buzz in the air, like everyone was sharing a collective secret. As we approached, I could see the gleaming shelves from inside, stacked with high-end clothes and electronics. This wasn't the usual cheap knockoff stuff you'd find in those pop-up kiosks at malls. These were the real deal, or at least they looked like it. I turned to my friends, who were just as excited as I was. "I don't know," Something feels weird about this, I said, half joking, half serious. I mean, why would such a great sale be happening here, of all places? But they waved off my concern. It's probably just a promotion to get people in, my friend said with a grin. You know, like those crazy Black Friday sales. We all laughed, and I shook my head, feeling silly for second-guessing myself. We waited in line for a good 10 minutes before they finally opened the doors. A young employee with too much enthusiasm welcomed us in. "Hurry up! The sale's going fast," he said, ushering everyone in. I looked around as we stepped inside, noticing the odd sense of urgency in the air. People were grabbing items off the shelves like they were afraid they'd miss out. I figured it was just the excitement of a good deal. But there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The store was well lit, shelves stocked with designer clothing, watches, electronics. But the more I looked, the more the items felt out of place. The electronics were too shiny, almost brand new, but with packaging that looked a little too thin, as if it wasn't meant to hold anything for long. The clothes, too, were neatly folded, but had tags that looked slightly worn or faded. "Are these returns?" I asked my friend quietly as I picked up a leather jacket from the rack. She glanced over, shrugging. "Who cares? It's a designer jacket, and it's, what, a fraction of the price?" She was right. It didn't matter how the items got here. We were getting incredible deals. I grabbed a few items myself, putting them in my cart, a few shirts, some shoes, and a smart speaker I had been eyeing for months. As I approached the checkout, I noticed a sign near the register. Cash only, ID verification required. I raised an eyebrow. That was odd. A place like this, with items costing hundreds of dollars, only accepting cash, it didn't sit right with me, but I brushed it off. Maybe it's a security measure, I thought. And anyway, I was about to pay with cash, so it wouldn't be a problem. At the register, the cashier greeted me quickly, scanning the items and barely glancing at me as he swiped them through. His face was pale, his movements robotic. I handed over the cash, my excitement dimming slightly at the lack of warmth in the exchange. The cashier didn't even offer a smile, and when I asked for a receipt, he just handed me my bags and said, "Sorry, no receipts today. Just take your stuff." His voice sounded strangely mechanical, almost as if he was reading from a script. I didn't argue, but the unease lingered. As I walked out, I glanced at the others. Some people looked excited, clutching their bags like they just won a lottery. Others, though, seemed distracted, as if they were second-guessing their purchases. I noticed one woman whispering to her friend, looking at her phone like she was checking something, but the conversation was too quiet to make out. I stepped into the fresh air, the feeling of uncertainty starting to grow. I tried to push it aside. "It's just a weird sale," I told myself. "No big deal." But the more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Why had the store been so empty earlier? Why was the whole process so rushed? And the cash-only policy, who were these people really? As we walked back to the car, I felt a twinge of guilt. I didn't want to feel like I had been scammed. But something about the whole experience gnawed at me. It wasn't just the odd way the employees behaved or the rushed checkout process. It was everything combined. The store seemed too good to be true, and now that I had left, it felt like I had been part of something I wasn't supposed to see. But as I put my key in the ignition, I tried to convince myself I was overthinking it. After all, who doesn't love a good bargain? I just had to wait and see if my purchases were worth the price. Little did I know, I was only scratching the surface of what was to come. The next day, I was still riding high on the adrenaline of scoring those insane deals. I tossed the bags with my new clothes and gadgets in the back of my closet and went on with my usual routine. At first, everything seemed fine, until the texts started coming in. It wasn't anything alarming at first, just a random message from an unknown number with the details of my purchase. I thought it was some sort of marketing follow-up. I didn't think much of it until I checked my bank account. A charge had gone through, a big one, bigger than anything I'd bought and for something listed as premium retail services. I froze, staring at the screen. There were other smaller charges too, all from different places I hadn't shopped at. a few online stores I didn't even recognize. The total added up to well over what I had in my account. I started to feel that familiar knot of panic in my stomach. I opened the bags I'd brought home, checking the items again, but nothing seemed out of place. The jacket, the electronics, all looked fine. No signs of anything being tampered with. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was some sort of mistake. But how had they gotten my bank info? I hadn't used my card anywhere else. I dialed my bank, hoping they'd have an explanation. The representative was nice. "We'll put a hold on your account," she said. "But you might need to report it to the police. Fraud can sometimes take time to clear up." Fraud. It stung to hear it out loud. That's when I started putting things together. The cash-only policy, the rushed checkout, the odd, robotic behavior of the employees. Could it have been a setup? But why would they do that for just one sale? Maybe they weren't just selling goods. Maybe they were gathering more than just cash. I had that creeping sensation that someone had been tracking me long before I walked into that store. A nagging thought that I wasn't just another shopper in the crowd. Still, I couldn't ignore the fact that there was nothing concrete, no real proof of anything. Maybe I was just paranoid. Maybe I was just making connections that weren't there. I told myself to calm down. The next morning, I decided to go back. I needed answers, needed to feel like I hadn't just made a huge mistake. The store had to be there. I could confront them, demand a refund, figure out what was going on. I drove back to the plaza, feeling strangely detached from everything around me. The road seemed emptier than usual, and I started to wonder why I hadn't noticed this before. There should have been people shopping, maybe families walking around. But the place was almost deserted. As I pulled into the parking lot, I saw the familiar empty storefront where the pop-up had been. But something was different. There were no signs, no banner, not even the faintest trace of where the store had been. Just a plain, dull storefront with the blinds pulled down. No one in sight. I parked and got out, walking up to the entrance to check for a number or a sign. Nothing. The windows were blank, and the door was locked, but I could swear I saw someone moving inside. Just a flash of movement from behind the blinds. I knocked once, twice, nothing. I took a few steps back, feeling a strange sense of confusion settling over me. How could this be? The store had been there only yesterday. I walked around the building trying to peer inside, but it was no use. There were no signs of anything, no hints of the store ever having existed at all. I drove around the plaza one last time, looking for any sign of the pop-up, but it was as if the store had never been there. When I got home, I checked my phone, expecting to see some follow-up on the suspicious charges. But the messages from the unknown number had stopped. The silence only made things worse. I wondered if somehow I missed something important. The bank had no new updates. No one had called to tell me what was going on with my account. And despite my attempts to look up the name of the store online, I couldn't find a single mention of it. There was nothing. Just an empty hole where the pop-up had been, both in the plaza and in the records. I stared at the screen, the blood draining from my face. The email address looked fake, an odd mix of random letters and numbers. I deleted it immediately, but the fear lingered, gnawing at me. The store is gone, the employees are gone, and I'm still waiting for that final charge to clear.
So this happened to me last night, and I'm still not sure if I'm losing it or if I'm just really stressed out from the holiday rush at work. I work as a night guard at Macy's, and I've been doing it for 2 years, so the quiet is nothing new. But last night, it was different. It's always dead before Black Friday madness starts, but something felt off as soon as I started my rounds. I'm walking through the main aisle and I see this mannequin in the holiday display. No big deal, except its arm was twisted at this weird angle. I figured it was just a mistake, so I fixed it and moved on. But then, about an hour later, I passed by again, and the mannequin's facing the other way. Like it was facing the wall now, and I know I didn't leave it like that. I thought I was losing it, but okay, whatever, maybe I misremembered. But here's the thing. Every time I walked past it, the mannequin kept shifting. Its arm was twisted even further, like it was reaching for something. And I swear, when I glanced at the reflection in the glass, it was looking at me. I don't know how to explain it. I rush to check the security footage, hoping it's just me being paranoid, but nope. On the footage, I actually see it move. Like move. It blinked, and when I rewound it, I saw the whole thing. Its head jerking, eyes following me across the store. I'm staring at this footage, completely freaked out, when I hear a soft click, like a door opening. I look at the cameras again, and there's a door slightly ajar. I swear I hadn't opened it, and standing in the doorway I see nothing. But when I look at the reflection in the window display, the mannequin's there. Its eyes still locked on me. That's when I realized I wasn't alone anymore. Now I wish I could say I just bolted out of there, but I didn't. I was frozen, too terrified to leave, but too scared to stay. I thought, maybe if I just stayed at my post, the shift would end and it would all be over. But it only got worse. The mannequin kept moving, its position changing with every passing minute. I don't know how much time passed, but it felt like hours. Every time I checked the cameras, its head was tilted just a little more, its body a little closer to the aisle. I couldn't escape its eyes. I felt like it was waiting for me to do something, to react. I stayed, even though every part of me screamed to leave, because I thought, stupidly, that maybe if I just finished my shift, I'd be okay. Finally, the clock hit the end of my shift, and I rushed out without looking back. I didn't even lock up, I just ran out of there. I can't go back. Every time I pass that Macy's, I get a cold chill, like I'm being watched. And trust me, I'm not the only one. I heard from a buddy who works there now that weird things have been happening after hours. Mannequins moving, lights flickering, and the sound of footsteps echoing when no one's around. He says the night guard before me quit the same way, just never came back. I'm never working another night shift alone again. Actually, I can't even walk past Macy's anymore without feeling like it's calling to me.